if I hit the record button. Right, so we are now recording, and I'm going to hand over to Dr. Lena to introduce our guest. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Neil. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to our weekly Bioenergetics Research Group meetings. This week, we're very honored to have Sam Apple with us. Sam has recently released his latest book, Ravenous, about Otto Warburg, the Nazis, and cancer and diet connection. So we were very pleased to be able to have him come and tell us a bit about what he's been doing. He's on the faculty of the Masters of Arts and Science in Science Writing and the Master of Arts in Writing programs at Johns Hopkins University. Prior to his arrival at Johns Hopkins, Sam taught creative writing and journalism at the University of Pennsylvania for 10 years. If you've read the book, you'll realize that he's got quite a gift. He taught creative writing and journalism at the University of Pennsylvania, like I said, for 10 years. And he holds a Bachelor of Arts in English and Creative Writing from the University of Michigan and an MFA in Creative Nonfiction from Columbia University. He's the author, like I said, of Ravenous, but before that, American Parent and Schlepping Through the Alps. And he has published journalistic features on a wide range of topics. But in recent years, his primary topic, what he's been writing about most, is science and health, which brings him to us to talk about this diet-cancer connection. His work has appeared in the New York Times. I read your 2016 article, actually, that sort of led into this whole book, which is really fascinating. And the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Wired, the Los Angeles Times, the Financial Times Magazine, ESPN, the magazine, the MIT Technology Review, and McSweeney's, among many other publications. And Schlepping Through the Alps was a finalist for the PEN America Awards for first work of nonfiction. So I won't take up too much more of your time. I'll just hand it over to you and tell us a bit about what you discovered about cancer research, Otto Warburg, the Nazis, and how we got to our current situation in terms of diet and health and the future direction, perhaps, of research.
Sure. Thank you, Alex and Neil and the entire Bioenergetics Research Group. I'm honored to be here. I'd like to go ahead and share my slides and talk to everybody for a little bit, and then I'll be happy to answer whatever questions you might have at the end. So I'm just going to share here. Okay, can everybody see my slides there? Okay, great. So this is my book, Ravenous, and it's Otto Warburg, the Nazis, and the Search for the Cancer Diet Connection. And the book came out in May of this year, May 2021. And since then, I've been doing some talks and trying to answer questions. So I'm just going to kind of give you a very big picture overview of the arguments in this book. And it really begins before Warburg. Warburg is my main character in the book, and I'll talk about him quite a bit in the next few minutes. But the story really that I tell begins before Warburg. It begins in the early 20th century and late 19th century when people around the world, or particularly in Europe and North America, we're starting to see that cancer was on the rise. It was growing more and more common, and people were beginning to get panicked. And one of the first people to notice this was Frederick Hoffman. He was a famous epidemiologist, and he wrote a book in 1915 called Cancer Mortality Throughout the World. And it was at the time the biggest statistical analysis of a disease ever performed, just a massive tome. And it really began because of his insurance work. He kept seeing cancer showing up on more and more death certificates and wondering why it was happening. So he does this massive investigative report and determines that it's a real phenomenon, that cancer is growing more and more common. But he also points out something else, which is that surprisingly, it isn't happening everywhere. There are some countries where not only is cancer not increasing, that it seems to be almost no cancer at all. And many different doctors from the West were either missionaries or they were humanitarians like Albert Schweitzer, who goes to Gabon and examines thousands of patients, and is quite surprised that he isn't seeing cancer. His quote here: "On my arrival in Gabon in 1913, I was astonished to encounter no case of cancer." And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these reports, many of them published in BMJ and other leading journals. And these are trained physicians. They know how to diagnose cancer. They see thousands of patients, and they rarely find it. And it's mysterious. What is it about living in, a modern industrialized country that causes cancer? Because there's clearly a difference. And I think, it sounds provocative, but I think this is actually well accepted, that some aspect of a modern lifestyle is responsible for cancer. There are different estimates. Some people put it at, some experts put it at around 50%. Often I found the number 70%, some as high as 90%. So of course, some cancers can be inherited. Some are unlucky mutations, but something about the way we live seems to cause cancer. And to me, that really is the most important question, that we should be focused on and should always be focused on, because, of course, you can't prevent everything, but we can prevent a lot. And the question is how we do that. And we can't really begin that program of prevention unless we fully understand what's causing cancer. I think it goes without saying that we've made some important discoveries. Smoking, first and foremost, when lung cancer really picked up in the 1920s and 30s, we were able to identify smoking as a leading cause of cancer and to work on prevention. But smoking is not the entire story. And I'm going to argue today that we may be still to this day overlooking what might be the biggest component of all. So when I think about cancer in a big picture sense, I like to think about sort of two aspects of it. One is what I just talked about, the epidemiology, what's going on at the population level. How are people living or eating or doing things differently that might be responsible for cancer? And then the other component, of course, is what's going on inside the cancer cell. We have, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries to the day, these two sort of parallel lines of research, the population and the cell. So I want to think about what's going on in the cancer cell and to raise the question of, can we connect it to what's going on at the population level? Is there something about the way that a cancer cell functions that may explain why it is that the way we live today causes cancer? So to begin that discussion, I focused on Otto Warburg because he made a discovery in 1923, which I think is really fundamental to understanding cancer and to making this connection that I've spoken about between lifestyle and cancer. And Warburg was a brilliant scientist who was born in the late 19th century to a father, Emil Warburg, who was a famous physicist and a brilliant researcher. Emil Warburg, Otto Warburg's father, was friends with Einstein and Fritz Haber and Emil Fischer and Max Planck and many of the great scientists of the era. And Otto Warburg grew up around these people and assumed that he was also going to make a great discovery and wanted to change the world in the way that all these people that he knew had changed the world. So he decides to focus on cancer, I think largely because it was a disease of his time. It was sort of the big question in the earliest 20th century. Why is cancer growing more and more common? He, like many other people, understood that, it wasn't just that people are living longer, that there were new diagnostic techniques. I'm not going to go into those arguments now, but I address all that in my book and would be happy to answer questions about that. But the rise of cancer seemed to be real, and Warburg wanted to figure it out. But, as I mentioned, his father was a physicist, so he begins to look at the cancer cell through the lens of energy, and always throughout his career was focused on energy and how a cancer cell uses energy to fuel its growth. So the assumption naturally was that a cancer cell is growing, needs more energy than a healthy cell. And he begins to study how much oxygen cells use. So he sees that, if you take a sea urchin egg, a single cell, and watch it grow, it'll take up a lot more oxygen and it'll multiply. And Warburg expects a cancer cell to do that as well. And what he finds is really quite surprising. In 1923, he sees that cancer cells are not, in fact, using more oxygen than other cells. Instead, they're taking up a lot of glucose, a lot of these nutrients, but they're fermenting it. They're doing the same things that microorganisms do. They're basically splitting the glucose molecule in two and quickly processing it and then fermenting it, putting it out of the cell in the form of lactic acid, in the way some bacteria that give us yogurt do. Other fermenting organisms, of course, give us alcohol and carbon dioxide. But it's the same process that cancer cells are using that all these organisms that give us so many of our favorite foods are using. It was a strange phenomenon, and Warburg concluded right away that it was really fundamental to cancer, that this is a very basic switch the cancer cell makes. And again, it's surprising because, as you can look here, the Warburg effect, this phenomenon that he discovered, is now called, it's surprising because a cancer cell does have access to oxygen, but it's turning to fermentation, this less efficient process, despite having access to oxygen. So instead of getting 36 ATP is like this currency that the cell can use to run reactions. It's using this much less efficient process. And why a cancer cell does this, what's in it for the cancer cell, is an interesting discussion. And if there are questions about that, I can make an attempt to answer. It's still debated to this day. But to me, the more important question is not what's in it for the cancer cell. That's an interesting theoretical question. But in the process, in the context of prevention, I'm interested in the question of what causes the switch. If this switch, as Warburg argued, is really fundamental to cancer, what causes it? Why does a cell that can use oxygen begin to turn to fermentation? And Warburg thought he knew the answer from a very early stage. He argued that if a cell is doing this, it has to be because there's some defect. The main power plant where oxidative phosphorylation is run, where a cell burns nutrients with oxygen, is in the mitochondria. So Warburg said, there has to be a defect. Something's not working right. So it turns to the backup engine. And that was his argument. And as I'll talk about a little later, that's not widely accepted. So the question still stands, is why a cancer cell makes this switch. And just to give you an idea of how fundamental this is, or what a kind of interesting way, at least in my mind, it is to think about cancer, I wanted to show this slide, which I actually took from Craig Thompson, who is one of the most important cancer scientists alive, I would argue. He's the president and CEO of Memorial Sloan Kettering, one of the top cancer institutes in the US. When he talks to students, he talks about the Warburg effect and this shift to a different kind of metabolism. And he shows this slide that I have here, everyone's first cancer experiment. And he shows that cancer really is behaving a lot like a microorganism. One of Warburg's first papers, when he wrote about this, he said, what I've really discovered is that cancer behaves like yeast. And then Craig Thompson is really making the same point. He shows that once a cell, a cancer cell, can eat all at once, it does what microorganisms do. It just eats and eats and eats and multiplies and multiplies and multiplies. And as Thompson also points out, when it grows near the crust and runs out of the nutrients, it needs glucose and a source of nitrogen, it metastasizes it. It spreads out to another piece of the bread and starts to grow some more. So it's really a striking fundamental parallel. So Warburg, this is a pretty widely accepted phenomenon. Warburg's explanation of why it happens is controversial, but the cancer cells take up a lot of glucose and ferment it. It happens in 70% or more of cancers, and it's accepted. Warburg wins the Nobel Prize. He actually wins it for, actually not for his cancer research, he was nominated for that, but for related research on how cells breathe, how cells use oxygen. He discovered the key final step in the process. But he's a widely celebrated scientist who many people think is on the path to curing cancer. And of course, the Nazis take over, and this is a big part of my book. And Warburg should have been, probably more fearful of the Nazis than anybody. Not only does he have a Jewish father, but he's also not quite openly gay, but probably as close to openly gay as you can be at the time. He lives with his male partner. And so he has every reason to fear the Nazis. And yet he stays in Germany when so many others leave. And I'm not going to go into that in great detail, though it's an important part of my book. But it really is a striking thing that in 1941, after the war has started, the Nazis call Warburg into the Nazi headquarters, which I pictured here in this slide. And they tell him that he's going to be allowed to live so long as he focuses on cancer. And sure enough, the Nazis not only protect Warburg, but relocate him to a new institute in the countryside when bombs start to fall near his institute. And it's really, why they choose to do this is really interesting. But the ultimate explanation is that Hitler and many other leading Nazis were really focused on cancer, partially because they were hypochondriacs and cancer was growing more common. And partially because Hitler himself had lost his mother to breast cancer and was very focused on the disease. So we have the post-war period. Warburg survives the war and becomes more convinced than ever that his discovery that a cancer cell turns to fermentation is the entire explanation of cancer. And he makes more and more extreme statements about this. And then, in 1953, researchers began to use radioactive glucose. They can trace metabolism in a new way. And they see that it is true what Warburg said, cancer cells are taking up a lot of glucose and fermenting it, but they also still seem to be doing respiration in their mitochondria. So Warburg, this shouldn't have been so controversial. Warburg's original studies showed that the cancer cells can actually do both. They continue to use respiration to some extent while they use fermentation. So running the power plant and the backup engine at the same time. But Warburg had grown after the war. He was making more and more extreme statements that it was all fermentation and respiration wasn't relevant. So even though his fundamental finding hadn't been overturned, it became a big controversy. And Warburg was incredibly arrogant, maybe the most arrogant scientist in human history. And when he finally won the Nobel Prize in 1931, his first response was, "It's about time." So, he was outraged that anybody had disputed his thinking on cancer. And he begins to, speak to the media and talk about fermentation, this switch to fermentation as being the key to cancer. And in 1956, he gets into a back and forth with some of his critics, and he was a really elegant writer. And he made this statement in Science in 1956: "Imagine two engines, the one being driven by complete and the other by incomplete combustion of coal. A man who knows nothing at all about engines, their structure and their purpose, may discover the difference. He may, for example, smell it." So this was Warburg's sort of basic argument for until the end of his life, that we were making all sorts of complicated discoveries about what's going on inside the cancer cell. And many of them were, not insignificant, but we're sort of overlooking or sort of failing to appreciate this most fundamental thing that he had discovered. He actually appeared before a group of Nobel laureates in the early 1950s and told them everything they thought they knew about cancer was garbage. All they needed to know was that a cancer cell, relies on fermentation. So this idea is not, because Warburg's ideas, he was making extreme statements. A lot of his arguments were being ignored in the scientific community after the war. And they weren't entirely ignored, though, by the larger public. And surprisingly, Rachel Carson, who's a science journalist in the United States, who really changes the world with her book, Silent Spring, actually writes a lot about Warburg in the context of cancer. And it's very focused, this book, which led to a lot of environmental policy changes in the United States. It argues actually that Warburg's understanding of how cancer progresses is right. Rachel Carson argued that we have all these poisons in our environment, and they poison the mitochondria, the use of oxygen, and they force the cell to switch to fermentation. So she writes about Warburg and draws a lot of attention to his work. But meanwhile, Rachel Carson's book is causing a lot of panic in the United States and around the world. And cancer rates, as I talked about at the beginning of this talk, are continuing to rise throughout, began in the late 19th century, but it's growing more and more common. So we have these periods of scares. And another one after Rachel Carson, in the 1970s, we get another sort of big cancer scare. And America launches what it's called the war on cancer. Interestingly, it's almost exactly 50 years ago to this day that Richard Nixon declared this war on cancer. And the idea was really that they were going to figure out how to cure cancer, but also to solve this question that I began the talk with. What is it about the way we live now that causes cancer to be so much more common? Because the evidence had continued to mount. In the post-war period, there are all these new studies. One famous example is Japanese women and breast cancer. Women in Japan who were native Japanese had very low rates of breast cancer, and then they would come to the United States and have children that were entirely of Japanese descent, and their children and their daughters and granddaughters would have cancer rates at the same rate as any other American women. So it seemed just moving to the United States from Japan was a major cause of breast cancer. So this question, what is it that's causing it, returns. And America actually turns to two British saviors, Richard Dahl famously, and Richard Peto. And Dahl was a natural person to turn to because he had been, as many of you probably know, the person who did the most to figure out the link between smoking and cancer. And so they produced this report for the American government, and they try to get to the bottom of this question: what is it that causes cancer? And you can see from this chart here, the single biggest cause they come up with is unhealthy diet. They put at 35%, and they put smoking at 30%. And when they say diet, they don't mean chemicals added to the food. They mean like the basic components of diet, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and specific foods that we eat. The chemicals are included in the environmental exposures. And this is a provocative finding in part because Rachel Carson had put all the emphasis on chemicals, but Dahl and Peto actually said, no, diet is actually the single biggest cause, not these chemicals. But what's even more interesting, I think, is a statement that, I think has been lost. But if you read the original report, they actually acknowledge that they know surprisingly little. They say diet could be as low as 30% of the cause of cancer, but it could also be as high as 70%. It's very hard to figure it out. As has been pointed out that smoking, one epidemiologist said smoking was like a turkey shoot. It's very easy to do a study and say, these people have lung cancer, which ones smoked and which ones didn't, and to figure out that smoking is an obvious cause. But with diet, it's much harder because people eat so many different foods. It's very hard to isolate them. You can't, of course, do a controlled experiment as you would like, randomize people to different diets over decades would be impossible. So all you're left with are these sort of inconclusive epidemiology studies. And again, matching that to what we're understanding about what's actually happening inside of the cancer cell. So around the same time in the 1970s, we have the discovery of oncogenes, of genetic mutations that cause cancer. I mean, it had been suspected for some time that cancer, was related to problems in the DNA, but for the first time in the 1970s, they can point to a mutation in a specific gene that is responsible for cancer. This all happens, of course, in the aftermath of the discovery of the structure of DNA by Watson and Crick and Franklin in the 50s. And now cancer science is really entering a new place. And what's significant about this is it completely wiped Warburg off the map. Now that cancer scientists were getting into the DNA and specific mutations, what Warburg discovered about the switch to fermentation was considered, that's old world biochemistry. That has nothing to do with why a cancer grows. Cancer scientists understood, of course, that the growing cells need energy, they need nutrients, but it was thought of as a passive response to the needs of a cancer cell, which were dictated by these oncogenes, which in turn cause these signaling pathways to cause the cell to divide and divide and divide. And when a cancer needed nutrients, sure, it took them up, but it was irrelevant to the deeper story of cancer. Warburg's enzymes became began to be known as housekeeping enzymes. When that term is still sometimes used, but not completely irrelevant, but not worth studying if you really want to understand what cancer is. So all these metabolism charts that had been on the walls, which showed the Warburg effect and metabolic pathways, started to come down, and all these new molecular biology posters went up. And scientists that I interviewed actually described seeing like Warburg apparatus. He used this manometer to study how much oxygen or a cell was using. They were being thrown in the trash. I mean, literally, like scientists tell me these stories, just completely lost. And just to give you a sense of how much was forgotten, both because Warburg was considered a relic and because of his extreme statements, and ultimately because of the discovery of oncogenes, how much disappeared. You can look at this famous textbooks, which comes out in the first years of the 21st century. The Biology of Cancer doesn't even mention Warburg in the first edition. The Emperor of All Maladies, this famous and really wonderful book about cancer, doesn't mention Warburg. There's a famous paper, The Hallmarks of Cancer, which identifies sort of these 6 fundamental things that have to happen for a cell to become cancerous. Doesn't mention Warburg in the first edition. And yet, what I put on this slide, if you look on the left side, you'll see what is really ironic and strange about this whole story. Even as all this metabolism stuff is forgotten, a new test comes, a new diagnostic technique appears, known as a PET scan, which actually works just by looking at where a cell is taking up more glucose, basically where the Warburg effect is taking place. And that's where you actually have cancer in your body. So there was this sort of cognitive dissonance, Warburg completely forgotten, and yet a new diagnostic test that's literally staring everybody in the face, but it's just more or less forgotten about. And then along comes in the late 1990s, Warburg is basically rediscovered by these new molecular biologists, not because they were really interested in metabolism, but because they were taking these signaling pathways that were turned on by oncogenes, by mutations, and just trying to follow them to see, what they caused to happen in the cell. And what they started to see was that these famous oncogenes were actually controlling metabolism. Chi Van Dang, one of the important scientists here, discovered how lactate, how this oncogene MYC, which controls many different aspects of the cell, was actually controlling LDH, this fundamental enzyme and fermentation. And the Warburg effect, and Craig Thompson, who I mentioned before, did something similar, looked at the oncogene AKT and saw that actually, and perhaps not surprisingly, that it was controlling, metabolism and how much glucose the cell was taking up. So what you really start to see in the late 1990s is a synthesis that these molecular biologists were rediscovering the Warburg effect through their study of oncogenes. And they make a really provocative argument that, the way to think about cancer had been that it's a cell's ability to multiply autonomously, to divide and divide and divide without attention to the rest of the body. And what Thompson and Dang and others have argued is that, yes, that's true, but it's also a cell's ability to control its own eating, to eat whenever it wants to take up nutrients autonomously. And they argue that this is actually probably the more fundamental step, because, and Chi Van Dang here uses the analogy of a building project. You're trying to create a building and you're putting up new buildings. You can't do it unless you have control of the fuel that's coming in and the bricks and the cement. You can't just build without a coordination with the resources and the materials. And so, what they argue, Craig Thompson actually said it's a catastrophe if the cell tries to grow and it doesn't have a nutrient supply. The cell, essentially commits suicide via apoptosis. So what they argue is that the eating, the taking up of nutrients is actually the first step, the most fundamental step. And once a cell gains an ability to take up nutrients, then it reawakens, the possibility of growth, that a cell that is not cancerous in our bodies, should not be thinking about growing. A cell under normal, a healthy differentiated cell doesn't grow unless, it gets instructions from other cells to do so. And it really is a fundamental shift in how we think about cancer. And it's led to this really remarkable rediscovery of the Warburg effect. And, they're now, metabolism is back in the mainstream, and there are new, journals and research centers focused on metabolism. So it's been a huge reawakening, but all of this is still focused on what's going on inside the cancer cell. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm interested in that and in the epidemiology and how you pair the two. So it's an interesting coincidence that I think that in the late 1990s, at the exact same time that some scientists are working at the bench and discovering that these metabolic enzymes are fundamental to the first stages of cancer, the epidemiologists are also discovering something really important, which is that cancer is much more closely linked to obesity than anybody had appreciated. The first studies come out in the late 1990s, and more have been appearing ever since. And, at latest count, and I think, this is actually a very conservative estimate, but at latest count, we have 13 cancers. You can see them on the slide here that have been linked to cancer. This doesn't include prostate cancer, which I think is quite compellingly linked as well. And in the United States alone, this is responsible for over 600,000 cancer diagnoses a year. So, just think about the striking parallel that somewhat by coincidence, at the same time that cancer scientists are rediscovering how a cancer cell functions by over-consuming glucose, another group of scientists are rediscovering that something about the way we eat, the way we put food into our mouths, is deeply connected to cancer. And I don't think it can be a coincidence that these two phenomena are connected in some way, that they were discovered at the same time as connected. I mean, it may be a coincidence, but something has to be going on here. And I think this is one of really the key questions. And one, very surprising thing is that these two groups of scientists are not necessarily communicating with one another. The epidemiologists are in one place, the cancer scientists at the bench are in another. And there's really nobody whose job it is to try to figure out how all these different threads connect. And, that's one place where I think, journalists do have a role sort of as dot connectors. But I just want to highlight that, this was not a new idea. It had been lost in Pito and Dahl. If you look at their 1981 report, they say there's not yet compelling evidence that cancer is linked to obesity, and that's part of the reason I think why they concluded 35% rather than closer to 70%. But if you look back throughout the history, as I did in my book, you'll see that this idea was coming up again and again, that cancer was linked to something about the way we eat and to obesity, or to what they called overnutrition. At the beginning of this talk, I mentioned Frederick Hoffman, and he had written this massive tome showing that cancer was on the increase. In 1937, he did a second book, which was equally massive, and concluded with these lines here, which I'll read. "I consider my own duty discharged in presenting the facts as I have found them, which lead to the conclusion that overnutrition is common in the case of cancer patients to a remarkable and exceptional degree, and that overabundant food consumption unquestionably is the underlying cause of the root condition of cancer in modern life." So already in 1937, some of these experts have concluded that we do have an answer to why cancer is so much more common in the West, and that has to do with overnutrition. But overnutrition is a vague term, and it doesn't really answer all the questions that I have. If eating too much is the problem, then why is it that animals in the wild, when they come into an abundance of food, they don't seem to get obese and get cancer? They in fact, tend to thrive and multiply. And we have many societies in the anthropological record that have had plenty of food, that have eaten well, and had abundant crops and meat, and have been perfectly healthy, amazingly healthy. So just talking about quantity of food, to me, doesn't really get to the root of the problem. So, but then what is it? What is it that's connecting obesity to cancer? What is it about, the way that we eat and the way the cancer cell eats that might have a connection? So also around the same time, in the late 1990s, another group of scientists, epidemiologists, are looking at not just obesity, but specifically the hormone insulin. This is one of a number of papers that comes out around this time, which raises the question of whether or not insulin, this hormone that is released whenever we eat carbohydrates in particular, a little bit protein, very little with fat, might be part of the story here. Insulin is actually, can function like a growth factor. I like to use the analogy of a fertilizer. So it's telling, cells, or it can function to tell cells to grow. It's an anabolic hormone. And scientists are finding that insulin, which is known to drive obesity, also seems to be deeply connected to cancer. In fact, when cancer cells, many types of cancers, when you grow them in the lab, as some of you may know, insulin is actually part of the formula you need to make the cancer cell grow. And when you wean the cancer cells off the insulin, many of them will actually die. So, there's this compelling evidence that insulin is part of the story. Just to mention a few other factors, which I find compelling, cancer cells tend to be covered in insulin receptors. Another closely related hormone, insulin, like growth factor 1, is also very closely linked to cancer. And studies in rodents find that when you can cause cancer to increase or decrease based on how much insulin is administered. So there's a lot of compelling evidence. And what's striking about this is, to this day, scientists often talk about obesity causing cancer, but there's an equally compelling explanation that it's not actually the obesity itself, but insulin driving cancer and obesity. So what does all this have to do with Otto Warburg, and why do I think this brings it all together? Is, as it happens, insulin turns on a pathway in the cell known as the PI3K pathway. And this pathway, which has really been discovered first and foremost by Lewis Cantley, who is at Weill Cornell, one of the United States leading cancer scientists. He found out that that this is basically an oncogene, this PI3K, that turns on cancer, and that it can be turned on in various different ways. But as the term that Cantley used was that insulin is the champion of PI3K activators. Nothing seems to turn on this pathway more readily than insulin. And when you look at where the common mutations are in cancer, starting in the early 21st century, they start to sequence cells, and they see where the sequence cancer cells, and they see where the mutations are. And it turns out that this is the single most commonly mutated pathway in all of cancer. This pathway that's turned on by insulin is actually the most commonly mutated pathway in cancer. So the question is, how do we put these pieces together? And the leading model, this is controversial in various ways, but the leading model is that we all throughout our lives get, microscopic tumors and, tiny tumors that would probably be wiped out by the immune system, or just remain dormant, if not for the fact that they gain the ability to become hypersensitive to insulin. They get a mutation somewhere in this PI3K pathway, and that if you have a lot of insulin flowing through your blood, this is going to give them a growth advantage and give them a chance to multiply, to remain alive, cell survival, you can see here. So if this is a hypothesis, certainly, but I think there's quite a bit of compelling evidence for it. But this could be an explanation for the diet cancer connection, that when you have a diet that causes your insulin levels to remain elevated, to have this fertilizer flowing through your blood at all the time, you're going to be at significantly greater risk for not all cancers, but many cancers. And, if that's correct, the question that we have about our diets might be, what is it about our diets that causes insulin levels to rise? What can we do differently to keep our insulin levels in check? That's what it all comes down to. Now, it's very hard to, as I mentioned before, to figure out the connection between any single food and cancer, but it's not especially hard to figure out the connection between any single food and hyperinsulinemia, this condition that causes insulin levels to rise. So the last chapters of my book are particularly focused on carbohydrates and particularly sugar. When I say sugar, I don't mean glucose or blood sugar. I mean sugar, the sweet white stuff, which is known as sucrose. And the reason I focus on sucrose, and this is not, I'm a journalist, I'm just saying what the scientists that that talked to me saying, Lewis Cantley, first and foremost, has really spoken out about this a lot. It's pretty well documented that no food will cause insulin resistance, this condition which leads to elevated insulin, more readily than sugar. It appears to be this unique combination that sucrose has. It's not just glucose, which of course raises insulin as well, but also this other molecule, fructose, which causes our bodies to store fats in our liver and around our organs. And this seems to lead to this insulin resistance and elevated insulin. So the model that I'm proposing here is that sugar came into the diet beginning in the 19th century in huge quantities. You actually see that from the epidemiology. The sugar consumption maps quite closely to the rise of obesity and cancer. And, already by the 1920s and 30s, scientists were making this connection and saying that, we have this massive sugar problem, and yet it continued throughout the 20th century. And so I think this excess sugar consumption could be leading to the rise of insulin resistance, and the rise of insulin resistance in turn making cancer a more common disease, and that the explanation for why cancer was so rare in these other populations I talked about, maybe that they were metabolically healthy, that they didn't have insulin resistance. And, if you look at in America today, by one estimate, almost 90% of adults have some degree of insulin resistance. So it's a massive problem. And just eliminating sugar, sugar would be the first step, but in some cases getting those insulin levels down may require cutting other carbohydrates as well. But what's encouraging, I think, is that you actually do see that people have great success in restoring metabolic health by cutting out carbohydrates. And just to tie all the threads together, and then I'll open it up for questions. I just want to stress that think about what insulin does in the body. It's got many roles, but one of its most fundamental roles is to tell a cell to take up glucose. That's connects directly back to the Warburg effect. When they raise the question of how it is that a cell gains the ability to overeat glucose and ferment it. One way it gains the ability is that it gains the ability to access insulin more readily, and that allows it to take up more glucose and to ferment it. And sure enough, when they take one of these enzymes that's in this pathway that's activated by insulin, and they activate it, they put a mutated form in, then it'll just switch on the Warburg effect. You can turn on the Warburg effect, but just by turning on this pathway. So it all comes together pretty impressively, I think, with the science that Warburg discovered how a cancer cell overeats glucose, this hormone in our body that tells a cell to overeat glucose, and this epidemiology, which connects this hormone to obesity and cancer. So I know that's a lot, and it's a big picture presentation. So I'm happy to answer any questions about this and to go into more detail. I will stop sharing my screen here.
Alex, sorry, you're muted still. Alex, unmute yourself. Can you do that? Hold on a sec. Hold on a second. Sorry, Sam. Firstly, while I'm trying to find how to unmute Alex, Sam, thank you very, very much for that.
Sure.
Alex, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
I can
there you go.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. That was really good. How you got so much of the book into just that short period of time. Fascinating stuff. And for those of you who haven't yet read the book, the ability to make that complex biochemistry accessible was really impressive. And also the historical elements, because science has changed over time. So like a lot of the terms that Warburg was using, we wouldn't use now, and so it sort of changes the way that we refer to things. So just to bring it all together from going through all the historical work up to today is a pretty impressive task. I can open it up before I ask any questions. Would anybody else like to ask a question to start with?
Sam, can you see the text? There's a question that's come through for you.
I will take a look. Yeah,
Yes, the what question there, after reading your book, I have been reading about sugar. Have you looked at, it's gone away now off my screen. Come back again, scroll up. Have you looked into the connection of sugar with mental illness and drug addiction and even perhaps COVID?
Yeah, interesting question. I have, there's a lot of interesting research going on about the, sugar addiction and how it activates the same sort of parts of the brain that you see activated with respect to drug addiction. So, I do think it's addictive and that there's a lot of interesting science there. I don't know a lot about that science. I have also been intrigued though by the COVID findings, not with respect to sugar in particular, but with respect to COVID and metabolic health. It seems clear that obesity is one important risk factor for cancer. I mean, for COVID, and I think that you can always sugar is I don't think it's controversial at all that sugar leads to obesity and metabolic problems. So once you accept that connection, then it's not hard to see a connection between sugar and COVID, which, again, you're not going to restore your metabolic health and make yourself, healthier with respect to COVID overnight. But I think, eliminating sugar and trying to get healthy will give you a better chance of surviving COVID. So I think that's important research.
Yeah, it's an area that we're actually investigating, and Neil's dissertation is actually related to that. And there has been work done by various other research groups looking at fasting and things to help with COVID treatment, and it's very promising.
Yeah.
All right. Zib, you said you've got several questions. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask your questions if you want to jump in, Zib.
Still muted, I think.
Still muted.
Zib asked to unmute. You should be able to unmute yourself, Zib. Right, while I'm trying to sort out Zib, then I'll move to the next one. After reading your book, I've been reading which I've got to that. As far as I know, humans have been religiously dying since the beginning of time. If the rate of cancer deaths increases, what death rates are decreasing? There were 72-year-olds in 1821. The percentage of deaths at 72 years of age due to cancer is in 2021 much higher than in 1821. What death cause was covering the cancer gap in 1821? What were people in the 80s and 90s in antiquity dying of? Let's go back to those deaths. That's from Alvaro. Does that question make sense to you, Sam?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and the biggest change, of course, is, the infectious diseases throughout history were leading causes of death. And that was partially what was so frustrating to the Germans. They were at the head of the world. Robert Koch and Paul Ehrlich and all the great German infectious disease specialists had conquered all these other diseases and were extending lifespan, and yet couldn't make any progress against cancer. And of course, death in early childhood was also very common. So just changing that, led to increases on longevity. But, it has, from the very beginning, it was very controversial to argue that cancer is growing more common because people were, living longer, and cancer is closely associated with aging, of course. So people thought the explanation was people were simply living longer, and that's why cancer was growing more common. But, again, as I talk about in the book, that is one aspect of it, but I think the evidence is quite compelling that many of these societies that were largely cancer-free, actually, old age was quite common. And, for the last 30,000 years, according to anthropology studies, people have been living into their 50s and longer.
Yeah, I think also people forget, prior to the golden age of antibiotics, a lot of people, you bang your head on a branch, it could kill you. You could get infected and you would have died. And we take that for granted. We just forget that so many people would die from accidents because it gets infected and they can't treat it. Also, and depending on different parts of the world, malnutrition and things, which was also changing. So while people were consuming more, some of the malnutrition stuff was disappearing in certain places. And so, yeah, so it would have replaced some of those other deaths. But Sammy, I think in your book, you definitely present both sides of the argument, and your opinion is that the arguments, is this correct, that the arguments for just the fact that people might be living longer and just the fact that we have better diagnostics don't really hold up against the weight of the arguments that something else was changing?
Yeah, I mean, partially that has to be true because even, in the early 20th century when, modern record keeping and diagnostics, caught up, you still see the increase, for decades later. So
yeah.
It's certainly true that in the late 19th century, the statistics aren't as reliable as you would like, but I think the evidence is overwhelming that the increase is real.
Yeah.
Zib, you have been unmuted, so if you want to fire away.
Zib, did you ask your question? I think he's.
No, I've unmuted him. I can see he's unmuted.
No, he doesn't look like he can hear us. Can you hear us?
All right. Well, while waiting for Zib, Sam, I've got a question for you
Sure.
to throw in there. So you've identified the risk of sugar, and you see the potential harm of that. My question becomes: I know you've got a family. How do you manage sugar in your own home? What's your approach to sugars in your own home? When your kids want sweets, is there a protocol? I'm just curious to know how you practically implemented your findings in your own life.
Yeah, it's a good question. I wish that I had a better answer. And unfortunately, I'm not succeeding that well. I'm succeeding with, by eliminating sugars from my own diet, but it's really challenging with kids. They're exposed to sugar everywhere, and they don't fully believe me that it's so harmful. And I like to joke that my dog is the only one who truly follows my diet. He and I are fairly low carb. But one thing I have cracked down on is sugary beverages, because the question is how sugar causes insulin resistance, and I think the strongest evidence of all is that drinking sugar is causing it. So I really do. My kids sometimes will have sugary drinks, but I really fight hard on that one and try to reserve that for special occasions. It's a society-wide problem, and I do, this might be controversial, but I'm more comfortable allowing them to eat or to drink sugar, artificially sweetened beverages than I am sugar not, because I think those are perfect, but because I think there's less reason to be worried about those beverages than sugar sweetened beverages. And not everybody agrees with that, certainly, but that's my feeling. But I think there's an interesting parallel here with the smoking phenomena. Richard Dahl, who made this connection between smoking and cancer in the 1950s, himself really couldn't believe it at first. Even though his own research was telling him this, he thought, smoking is so ordinary and such a part of our lives. He couldn't internalize that it was actually responsible for cancer. And I think we've reached a similar place with sugar, that even though there's more and more evidence that it's extremely harmful, not just in the context of insulin resistance cancer, but for many conditions. And yet we can't quite internalize it. It's so ordinary. It gives us so much pleasure at parties and desserts. So it's going to take some kind of reawakening, the way that it happened with smoking. I don't know how that's caused, but what's really striking is if you look back at the 19th century, the first part of the 19th century, it wasn't assumed that you have a dessert at the end of every meal. There weren't, factories churning out ice cream and sodas. And then it all starts to happen in the 19th century. And there's just this explosion of sugar.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the job of journalists. I think that your work is really key to bringing the science that we've been collecting data on for over 100 years to make it more accessible to people, so we can get this kind of message out there. When I talk to students who are actually studying science, who are actually studying nutrition, they just can't believe when you tell them it's not normal to eat a dessert after every meal. It's not normal to wake up and have Cocoa Pops, or that's not what human beings are meant to be doing. And it's hard because that's what they sell in the stores, right? So it seems like that's what people do.
No, I mean,
I have a follow-up, but I think Zib's mic is currently unmuted. So while it's working, Zib, do you want to ask your questions? It shows me that you're unmuted.
Now he's frozen.
It seems like I unmute him and then he
Yeah,
can't get
he's
in.
trying, it's not working.
I see he's on the chat now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm talking now. Okay, we're not hearing you. Zib, while I get to the next one, do you want to maybe type out one or two of your questions? Because according to my screen, we should be able to hear you, so I can't understand why we can't. But while we're waiting for that, maybe I'll go back to a previous question while Zib's typing.
I've got one here from Roslyn.
From Roslyn, yeah.
Has there been any suggestions into any experiments or testing into exactly how we could pinpoint the link between the diet and cancer?
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll never be able to do the perfect studies that we would like. As I mentioned, in a perfect world, we'd randomize two groups of people and feed all of them, almost identical diets, but change only one thing at a time and see which people are more likely to get cancer. That type of study we're never going to get. So I think what we're left with is, the laboratory science and sort of the big picture epidemiology. You do see, strong correlations between sugar consumption and cancer, and epidemiology studies that have been noticed actually by Richard Dahl as well. But by itself, I don't think it's very compelling. So what's most compelling to me is matching that epidemiology with this understanding of what's going on inside the cancer cell, and that evidence is growing more and more compelling. And it's also being matched with rodent studies, which is providing really compelling evidence about insulin and sugar and cancer. What's interesting in some of the recent literature from rodents, which again, anytime you talk about these studies, you have to point out that what's true in mice is often not true, usually not true in humans, it seems, with respect to cancer. But that said, it's been known for many, many years, since really the beginning of the 20th century, that you could overfeed mice diets high in carbohydrates or sugar and make them more likely to grow tumors. But more recent research has been really looking closely at, can you induce tumors with high levels of insulin? And that's starting to come out now, and it's still early days, but they are finding that what they know from the petri dish is proving true in rodents as well. So I think we're going to get more and more evidence, but I think there's enough evidence now for prevention. Maybe there's not necessarily enough evidence to say, I know this as a fact. Scientists should probably rarely say that, but in the context of prevention, I think we're already much more fearful of chemicals and banned chemicals that have been much less closely linked to cancer than insulin has. So if you think by that logic, there's enough evidence to be afraid of insulin, to think of high levels of insulin as being carcinogenic, and that those high levels are being caused by sugar. So the next logical step is, if that's true, why not eat in a way that would reduce that carcinogenic threat? And to me, it just seems logical.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. I think one of the things that we often talk about in when we're talking about nutrition and biochemistry is the toxicity of glucose, and I think that's one of the things that hasn't really been brought to the public's attention is that it is toxic, that we have really powerful systems to keep it in a small range because of how dangerous it is if it gets too high or too low. And the insulin's the main hormone that helps regulate blood sugar levels, and the counter-regulatory hormones, the whole slew of them, the cortisol, the adrenaline, all of those are meant to help balance out this powerful force that's insulin. And I think in your book, when you talk about insulin and insulin-like growth hormone and stuff, I think it helps make that point that this is a powerful system that you don't want to be just messing with every time you have a little snack.
Yeah, just to build on that, everything you said, if somebody heard that outside of this conversation, I think, oh, they're talking about diabetes. And I think that's part of the problem, that this is so much a diabetes paradigm that it's hard for people to also wake up to the fact that, what's true of diabetes may also be true of cancer, that we might be looking at, to the other side of the coin here. And, I asked Cantley, who's been at the forefront of this research, And he says, even to this day, he speaks at conferences, and people just can't make that leap from diabetes to cancer. That it's so ingrained that these are separate diseases that it's hard to think of them together.
Yep.
Okay. I see there's a question then from Kamal, who says, have you looked into how cognitive impairment linked with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's are associated with proteins which regulate glucose metabolism, and why those who have a high intake of sugar are at higher or increased risk?
Yeah, again, that's not, not my area of focus. I don't like to talk about it too much without knowing a lot, but I certainly, do see that that there's some researchers even refer to Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes, that impaired glucose metabolism is, I think, clearly a part of the Alzheimer's story. And I think that this root problem of insulin resistance and elevated insulin and altered glucose metabolism is at the root. I think not just diabetes and cancer, but many other conditions, probably Alzheimer's, certainly related to cardiovascular disease as well. So, I've said before, I think it's true, I could have written a similar book about a number of different diseases and chosen, instead of Warburg, chosen a different protagonist. I was interested in cancer in particular because it was so surprising to me. Like I sort of knew that, these other conditions were linked, but I never had thought that cancer was a part of this story as well. So that's why I focus on cancer, but I do think Alzheimer's is part of the same underlying condition.
Okay, then getting to Zub. So Zub says, firstly, Sam, great book, and thank you for your time today. Unfortunately, I still have 8 pages left prior to start of your presentation, so apologies if you have mentioned this in the remaining pages. Firstly, I liked your chapter on glucose versus fructose, but just wanted to know your thoughts on the Laron dwarves. Have I said that right, Zib? As you've mentioned earlier, as you've mentioned earlier, their negligible IGF-1 signaling is likely responsible for their reduced cancer rates. However, they do have a high incidence of NAFLD, so non-fatty liver disease, presumably as a result of the fructose component in their diet. However, this hasn't translated into an increase in cancer. So could this suggest that the glucose insulin signaling is more detrimental, the true doppelganger rather than fructose?
Yeah, well, and maybe I apologize if I exactly right, but my understanding of it, you could think of fructose causing cancer in 2 different ways. One, there's some very recent research which suggests that consuming fructose via sucrose, that's 1/2 of the sucrose molecule, might actually directly cause some cancers, and actually has been shown to turn on the Warburg effect. And you see this, particularly the evidence points to colorectal cancer. Most of the fructose is processed in the liver, but it actually, can feed a tumor directly, at least in, colorectal tumors and possibly some others as well. But I'm interested, first and foremost in fructose driving cancer by causing insulin resistance. And the hypothesis is, that insulin itself at elevated levels is acting like a growth factor, and also that it's leading to an upregulation of IGF-1. It's actually, they actually have shared receptors between insulin and IGF-1, and that insulin is leading to increased IGF-1 signaling. And it may be true that without that IGF-1 signaling, that you don't get all the way to cancer, and that would explain why the Laron dwarfs never actually develop cancer. I think that's my hypothesis, but there may be more to that story as well. I do find it to be a truly fascinating angle on the whole thing.
All right. Zib then goes on and says, secondly, you have some awesome references in the book from some of the scientists I follow. In relation to the evolutionary perspective of cancer proposed by Thomson, did you also consider the Fung theory? I was unsure who was the initial proposer for this and thought you may know.
I'm not, is that in the chat? I'm not exactly.
Jason Fung you're talking about.
Yeah, no, I know Jason Fung's work, and he's also written a popular book which covers a lot of this same material called The Cancer Code. But I'm not 100% sure. I think that what this might be a reference to is, if I understand it correctly, the idea that cancer cells in turning to fermentation are actually reverting to the an ancient biological mechanism basically losing the ability to process like an evolved cell. And so using fermentation is, I think Fung and others have used the idea of it's almost like a safe mode, something that a cancer cell can do. There's a lot of nuances to that argument, and I don't, I don't feel like I have full expertise in that, but I do think that it's broadly speaking, I think it's a good way to think about it, that that cancer cells are basically behaving in the manner of microorganisms, and that thinking about it through that lens allows us to ask the question what it is that turns on this metabolism in a microorganism. And an organism that isn't a part of a cellular community can turn on this proliferative metabolism just by being exposed to food, and it will consume all at once and multiply. We have this added layer of social control of our cells. Fred Thompson likes to say that, really all of our cells are in a multicellular organisms are in a community, and they've all signed a pact that says we're only going to eat when we're told to eat. So we're really not like microorganisms until the cancer develops, until a cell gains this ability to break the contract and eat whatever it wants to. And then once it gains that ability, it really does start to behave just like a microorganisms and revert to this ancient metabolism, if you can call it that. So, what I always think about is, how does it gain that ability? Is it just an unlucky mutation? If that's the case, that's fascinating. You get an AKT mutation, you can overeat glucose. That's fascinating, but it doesn't, that would just be bad luck. But my question is the insulin in our bodies actually interacting with those mutations and actually making them more effective? And if that's the case, then it's actually, our own insulin, which is driving this reversion, stuffing ourselves with glucose and turning on this metabolism. Craig Thompson once said that, when he thinks about the Warburg effect, one way to think about it is just a cell getting more glucose than it ever should, than it ever wants to. And once it gets that glucose, then it starts to think, I got a lot of new ideas. I can do a lot of new things.
Yeah, I think your castle analogy was really useful, and I take it you're a fan of Nick Lane's as well, because you inserted one of his analogies into your own analogy. It was
yeah. No, I'm
quite well done.
Fan of his work as well.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say though, that what you just mentioned, and I think it was Craig's quote about it's when the cell gets is more than it ever needs of glucose, and I think what people might not appreciate is things like insulin resistance and the ability to switch to fermentation are not in themselves pathological. They're actually mechanisms that the body can use. Like in pregnant women, they will actually initiate a level of insulin resistance to make sure that there's a glucose gradient to get food to the baby. And so, in other words, all of our cells have the ability to do these things, and we just don't turn them on when they're not supposed to be on. And in cancer, the problem is that I think you didn't really, I don't think you used the word natural selection, but you mentioned Darwin a few times, and the idea that you'd be naturally selecting for the cells and that would be able to thrive in an environment that has loads of insulin and loads of glucose. And so the mutations that come along get selected for when there's always mutations. Right now, we're all having mutations happen and we're fixing them or getting rid of the cell if we can't fix them. But in the case of the high insulin and high glucose, like you said in the book, they're actually being selected to thrive in this environment of heavy fertilizer.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And I really like the fertilizer analogy. I kind of wish I had driven that home more in the book, because the paradigm is often the seed and the soil, and it's supposed to be this controversial or provocative thing to remind people about the soil, by which cancer scientists are usually talking about metastasis and where a cancer will start to grow in a new organ, a new soil. But even in that conversation, what's often overlooked is the fertilizer. What soil they land on may be closely related to which soil is best fertilized by insulin.
All right, there's two more questions from Zib, but I think I'm going to just ask from two other people, then we'll come back to Zib's. So firstly, a question from Roxana, which I think, Alex, is probably more targeted at you. It simply says, is this book useful for biomedical students in year 2?
Yes. Yes,
All right.
we're going to be studying in more depth glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. So all of that, Warburg was at the root of all of those discoveries. Yeah, Mayeroff, he helped Mayeroff quite a bit with the glycolysis and obviously the fermentation, and then with going to lactate, and then Krebs. You'll learn, and if you read the book, you'll learn the Krebs relationship with Warburg and how he was able to do all of that, actually using the manometers that Sam mentioned, and yeah, and then the electron transport chain, the complex 4, Keelan renamed, but it was that was Warburg's respiratory ferment, is what he named it. So yeah, we'll be talking about that. And this book, actually, it's a nice, easy way to get into all of the complex biochemistry by creating the story around it all, that it makes it easy, more memorable, and helps you, not just think about memorizing pathways, but actually understanding the relationship between things and how they were discovered. So definitely for SLS 2016, it'll help.
And kind of related that, but Carl has asked directly to Sam. He says, Sam, other than reading your book, how would one follow the latest thinking on sugar and cancer or other illnesses?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are certainly other authors that are writing about this. Jason Fung has been mentioned. I've been influenced by others. Gary Taubes, in particular, has written a lot about this and influenced my thinking. So there are plenty of others, and there are a lot of good talks on YouTube. Craig Thompson and Cantley and others are on YouTube talking about these issues. I did want to mention, just, it occurred to me after the last question that, I sort of in my talk skipped over a relevant thing about, the bioenergetics here, which is, that the Warburg's hypothesis that cancer cells had effective mitochondria and were doing fermentation on necessity, is still not widely considered to be correct. So I never really had a chance to talk about what is, the leading hypothesis now. And the leading hypothesis now is that it is actually, about the bioenergetics, that this rapid processing of glucose is useful for a cell to be able to quickly build daughter cells. And, one of the hypotheses I find most compelling is that the fermentation actually allows the cell to dump electrons out quickly and to reproduce NAD, which is, fundamental for how a cancer builds things and builds daughter cells. So there's a lot of interesting science going on about why this is useful for a cancer cell or for any rapidly growing cell. But I was more interested in, the causal direction.
Yeah, in your book, you sort of approached, you didn't go too much into the ideas of epigenetics, but you did talk about the histone acetylation and things like that. So I think those are the things that we will be talking about more in the class. Interestingly enough, I think Warburg, my impression, and you would know better, but my impression was that right now, I think one of the ideas is that it's about reprogramming of the way the mitochondria are working due to the fuel supplies. And that would be it's not damage in the sense of ruptured membranes, which is one of the first things they learned, is that you don't get respiration if you rupture the membranes. But it's about reprogramming the efficiency across what we call coupling efficiency across the membrane, and how that gets reprogrammed. And in the end, Warburg might be correct in the fact that, yeah, that's what I meant by defective respiration. You've altered, it's no longer working the way it's meant to.
I'm just conscious of time. So Zib, I'm going to hold on to your second 2 questions for the moment. I'm sure that if we don't get to answer them all before 5:30, that I can mail them across to Sam and that Sam can try and get to them. So I'll just try and get to a few others. So Eden, I see you want to ask a question via your voice. Give me a few moments. I'll try and unmute you in a moment. But Rafero has asked a question. She says, at the start of the presentation, you mentioned the relationship between overconsumption of glucose and cancer. If glucose toxicity can cause cancerous tumors, do you know what happens in benign tumors that cause them to stop responding to the glucose?
Well, I would say that that's out of my area of expertise, but I wouldn't say that, so long as the benign tumors are growing, then, they are still, in theory, processing glucose and using that glucose to grow. The question, why they don't turn malignant, that's really outside of my area of expertise. So I won't attempt that one.
All right. And then while I try and unmute Eden, Alvaro has asked, he said, one question about your style. Was it a conscious decision to use many literal quotations, or it just ended up like this?
Many literal quotations. I think that I do use a lot of quotations. You should see the first draft of the book. I think I did that partially being a little self-conscious about being a journalist, stepping into these complicated science and scientific debate. And so as I went through the book, I wanted at every possible instance to say, hey, it's not just me, this is what the experts are saying, and this is what people in history have said, and to put those quotations in. But I do remember now that my first draft, my editor said, you got to cut some of that back.
All right.
Yeah, I will say also that I think that your use of notes to reference your sources makes this a really valuable book, especially for students that want to find out what you're talking about and what that source was that you got that information from. And a lot of popular science books, they leave that stuff out. So I think that adds a lot more value to your book.
Because that was one of the hardest parts of the whole process. I thought I was done, and I was like, oh my God, I still have to put all these notes together.
All right, Eden, I've unmuted you, so if you want to ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, good. So hi, Sam. Thank you for the talk. For a first year like me, that was I got to learn a lot, especially because obviously you're not strictly a researcher. So yeah, your knowledge was still way above where I was expecting it to be. But for a first year like me, I managed to get a bit of it. So my question is, right. So you referred to the major contributor to the manifestation of cancerous cells, that is diets, several times. You mentioned the 30 to 70% range in which it could be a major cause. You mentioned the case of Japanese women moving to America and having an increased rates of breast cancer. I'm assuming the implication was due to diet. And then you eventually said something along the lines of, obviously, it would be incredibly difficult to track a mass group of people's diets over years to get a good idea of how heavily exactly diet leads to cancer. And obviously, I agree. My question would be that hypothetically, if there was such a study that could be successfully carried out, and we found out like the worst case, 70% weighting of diet having effect on cancer was the case. How do you think awareness should be raised to the masses? Because there's already a lot of information available on negative effects of things like processed foods, which so many people don't take notice of. So yeah, how do you think people should make a change with that information?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. It's one I think about a lot. I certainly don't have any expertise that gives me an ability to answer that question, but I do think that, right now that when people think of sugar, they think obesity or they think diabetes. I don't think most people think of cancer. And I think cancer makes sugar scarier. So just getting this story out would certainly help. But I don't think that will be enough. I think it'll take really creative campaigns, learning the lessons of smoking and trying to understand what worked. Certainly warning labels could be one step. But it could be that certain influential, you get the right celebrities to start speaking out about this. I don't know if there's one thing, but I think if I were in a government planning organization, I would study smoking closely, because I think the parallels are really important. That there was the denial about smoking, then a gradual awakening, and now people still, of course, smoke, but it has gone down and everybody makes the connection. So I think we have to learn that lesson and somehow get it across. I mean, just to give you a sense of how far away we are from that right now, that even in hospitals are full of sugar, as is often pointed out. So we have a long way to go.
Well, even with the COVID that you mentioned earlier, part of the problem is the way that when we put people in ICU and the IV solutions that we're putting in their arms, is possibly part of the problem. So yeah, we have to address it at the hospital level and the clinical level.
Yeah. it's an enormous problem.
Right, with 7 minutes to go, I think we'll just get to Zib's next two questions and then we'll be able to wrap it up. So Zib then asks, what are your thoughts on the benefits of anti-hyperglycemics and their effect on reducing cancer risk? Also in relevance to this, and now it's just gone off my screen. Also in relevance to this, in one of your slides earlier, you featured mTOR. Would you think rapamycin would be beneficial in cancer risk?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the drugs because I know a little bit more about that. I was very interested in the relationship between metformin in particular in cancer, because metformin is a drug that lowers glucose, and by virtue of lowering glucose, lowers insulin. And in these retrospective studies where they look at people who took metformin and people, diabetics who took metformin, diabetics that didn't, they find that metformin was very protective against cancer, shockingly so. One cancer scientist said that metformin may have saved more people from cancer than anything else. It could be true. I'm inclined to think it is protective because it lowers glucose and insulin, but because these are retrospective studies, we don't know for sure. Maybe the people that weren't getting metformin were getting insulin, and it was the insulin that was actually driving the cancer rather than metformin protecting. So I would say the verdict is still out, and that, unlike diets, we actually can do, clinical studies of metformin in cancer, and, it's ongoing, and it's still too early to say, but, all things equal, I would bet that there is a protective effect, but we don't know for sure yet. With respect to mTOR, mTOR is, kind of the pathway that I talked about. PI3K is sometimes called a PI3K AKT mTOR pathway. So it's this fundamental, nutrient sensing, regulator in the cell. And I do think it's, really fundamental to the story. And, it's maybe slightly off from your question, but it reminds me of, what I think is one of the main interesting points in this book is that our cell, a single cell evolved to be exquisitely sensitive to nutrients. It's one of the most fundamental discoveries a cell has to make is, if you're a single cell, do I grow or do I conserve myself and, wait until there's more food along? Because if you want to reproduce, maximize your reproductive success, you can't multiply when there's not food around. So just mTOR being able to sense when nutrients are available and then to turn on anabolic mechanisms to grow is really fundamental to what a cell is and what a cell has to choose between. And so if you have mTOR activated, you're in that growth mode. And if you have rapamycin or another drug which slows down mTOR, there's reason to think that that could be protective. But mTOR is, it's a potent drug and could cause all sorts of other side effects and, immune suppression. So, I think we're a ways away from being able to prescribe it for cancer prevention, but I think there's promise eventually of getting there to some mTOR-like drug. Some rapamycin-like drug.
And he actually, just to say, the metformin was addressed near the end of the book.
Yeah.
So Zib just commented that it was metformin I had in mind, just wondering why it wasn't featured in the book, as it supports your story quite well. Zib, it might be in your last 8 pages. So
it is near the end.
The last question then from Zib: during your discussion with the scientists in the field, did you notice any predominant diets or lifestyles being adhered to in order to reduce cancer risk?
I just to respond to Zib's last point. Ultimately, the reason I didn't say even more about metformin is because the evidence is based on epidemiology and these retrospective studies. I didn't feel like if I'm criticizing these studies in one context, I didn't want to say, okay, but I'm relying on them in the other context. But just back to this other question about diet. For me, the takeaway from the insulin stuff is the diet that makes sense for prevention is one that reduces insulin resistance and restores metabolic health. I think there are different ways to do that, and different people have different needs. My own choice is to follow a pretty low carb diet to keep my insulin levels in check and to hopefully make my cells insulin sensitive. I think for some people, it might be enough to just eliminate sugar. Maybe for some people, just to not drink sugar. and they can get away with other carbs. You know, people have different carb tolerance, but for me, and you know, I think for most American adults, it requires a certain amount of carb restriction to keep insulin regulated, to keep glucose levels normal, and to remember, you know, in the context of this, what I always like to point out to people is that if you go and have your glucose check now, your reading may be entirely normal. It doesn't mean that you don't have a problem with insulin. You know, for many, many years, the insulin levels are actually going to be elevated and keeping your glucose in check. So, you know, if you're concerned about this, then, you know, the first thing you might do is go in for a test of your actual insulin levels as opposed to your glucose levels.
Yeah. We are going to run out of time.
I was going to say that brings us nicely to time, and I think covers everything. Zib has posted a few responses to that. You guys can read on the screen. So firstly, just from me, Sam, thank you very much. I think that's been absolutely brilliant. And Alex, I will ask you to wrap everything up for us.
Yeah, Sam, that was fantastic. I could have talked to you for hours, like I said before, and you're always welcome to come back. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Yeah, if I'll talk to you afterwards, just to see where we might go. And I wanted to find out more about your next projects and stuff like that. So maybe I'll pass that back to the group and stuff when we after this. But I think we are going to run out of time in less than a minute. So thank you. I just want to say thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really great. It's an honor to be a part of this group. So yeah, I'd love to do it again sometime. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right.
Brilliant.
Neil, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just end the meeting. I'll stop the recording now, so we can stop.